Okay. All right. I think we're good to go on that. So welcome. I know people are going to continue rolling in as we start talking here, but like I said before, it is great to see you all tonight. I really appreciate all of your time being here. I know it's a busy time of year and a little later in the evenings, so we appreciate your attendance. Also wanted to acknowledge how many of you filled out that form ahead of time with questions for us. There were so many fantastic questions there. We're going to try towards the end of the evening to answer a few of those questions for you, but just wanted to say, I know that there is a lot of confusion, a lot of questions about what college admissions looks like, and we will try to help answer some of those tonight. So, okay, let's go ahead and get into it. So first of all, just a few quick introductions here. So if you don't know me already, I think I've talked to some of you, but my name is Karen. I do head up our college counseling program here at AJ Tutoring. Just so you know, I've been at AJ Tutoring for coming on about 14 years now in a variety of different roles, but excited to be heading up college counseling at this point. I also have several colleagues that you will be hearing from throughout the evening tonight in some capacity. Matt Furman, Peggy Anderson, and we also have Ryan Pelkey here with us as well. So that's our team. Just so you have an idea of what we're going over tonight, we do have a few things on the agenda. One major thing that we want to do is take you all through a timeline of, really the high school journey through the college application process. I think there are different things that you need to keep in mind if you're looking at this as the parent of a 9th grader, a 10th grader, a junior, a senior. You're at different stages of the process. But even for those of you who are parents of 9th graders or 10th graders, it's helpful to know what is going to be coming down the pike once you get into junior year and you're really looking at college applications in earnest. So we're going to talk you through the timeline of what all of that looks like. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into a few specific college admissions topics that a lot of you had questions about. So for example, essays, standardized testing was a really big question point that we got, extracurriculars. We'll talk a little bit about how colleges are going to read those applications, and then we'll finish up by getting to a few questions, talking a little bit about what we do at AJ Tutoring here. So that is the game plan for this evening. As I mentioned before, we are recording this. So if you do need to duck out at some point, no worries, we will email out that recording afterwards. And with that, we are going to go ahead and start talking through this timeline for the process. And for that piece, I am going to hand that over to Peggy Anderson.
Yeah, hi everybody. So as we were kind of explaining, it is not too early to jump into the college process when your student is in 9th and 10th grade. We like to start as early as we can, to really get a head start and to make sure that by the time your student is applying to colleges when they are a junior, that they haven't closed any doors accidentally or created any difficulties for themselves that they, weren't necessarily expecting. We want to make sure that along the way, they are paying attention to a couple different areas and making sure that, again, they're leaving all of those various doors and opportunities open for themselves so that when they are applying, they can apply to the schools that they think will be the best fit, and not just the schools that they are kind of narrowed down into based on their grades or their application overall. So right off the bat in 9th and 10th grade, you want to be taking a challenging course load for you. This is important that, the student is kind of acknowledging there are other options now that they are in 9th grade. They can kind of experiment a little bit with their classes, but they do have to take the core classes that they're given, including math, English, science, things like that. So whatever options they are given, they can kind of start to explore, but the key here is going to be getting good grades in these fundamental classes. The grades right away are going to be an indicator of how the rest of their high school experience is going to be and whether or not they can kind of continue with a more rigorous course load in the future. So making sure that they're paying attention to their grades right away in 9th and 10th grade and setting up a strong GPA for their junior year. This is going to be really, really important. This is also a really good time for freshmen and sophomore students to begin exploring all of the different extracurriculars that they have available at their school. This is going to include any clubs, any sports, any kind of after school volunteer work that they're able to find. And if they're eventually able to get any sort of leadership role or narrow down their focus into one certain path that really shows a commitment, a passion, sort of an acknowledgement of something bigger than themselves, and that they're willing to commit their time outside of school to this project, that's really going to look good on their activities list down the road. So 9th and 10th grade is definitely their opportunity to begin exploring these different areas and figuring out what they enjoy and what they may want to continue pursuing. They should also be considering taking the PSAT. Typically, this is offered for the first round in 10th grade, usually through the school. This is something that can, again, give the student an indicator of whether or not they should put more preparation into their test prep before they take the real SAT. This can also kind of give them a taste of what the real SAT is going to feel like. And they can also begin to consider what testing is going to look like for them down the road. We're going to definitely talk more about testing in just a little bit. Summer activities kind of bounces off of extracurriculars. So if there's any summer programs, internships, different classes that they want to take, again, things that are going to interest your student, different classes and courses that are going to expand their horizons and sort of give them a taste of different opportunities and different subjects that maybe they haven't explored before. As long as it's something that your student is willing, again, to commit the time and the effort to, it is going to look good on their applications later on. And this is a great time to, again, start thinking about what are their interests and what are their strengths. It's important to know what, they enjoy just as much as it's important to know what they don't enjoy as much. We want to know the areas that they're really strong and the areas that perhaps we can look at and improve over the next few years. And this is, when we incorporate various assessments, personality quizzes, and things like that to really make sure that we're finding matches and we're figuring out what path is going to work for your individual student and not everybody else. 11th grade is when the real kind of work kicks in for the college application process. So 11th grade is kind of your final opportunity to make your transcripts as robust as they can possibly be before you send them off to schools. You will be letting your schools know what your senior grades and classes are eventually, but this again is the last time where you're able to impress them with maybe AP or honors courses. And again, the GPA. This is going to be kind of your last opportunity to boost that GPA to the optimal level that it can be before you have to report it on your application. You want to make sure that you're taking challenging courses that you are able to succeed at and do well in. If these are courses that are perhaps a little bit too challenging and are now affecting GPA and grades, that's something worth considering. You don't want to take any classes that are really going to hurt your grades overall. That's not going to necessarily impress the admissions office. They want to see that you're able to tackle things at your level and, maybe recognize in the areas that maybe you need to take the regular courses and excel at those instead. Extracurriculars, again, this is the real opportunity to get those leadership roles, including president, treasurer, if they can, perhaps volunteer at a certain community organization for a certain number of hours. That would look really good as well. This is when they can, again, kind of really narrow down that focus and sort of show that passion and that determination with some sort of passion project. Something that really, shows how much they're willing to, again, commit the time and effort outside of school to something bigger than themselves. Sports are going to continue being important here. It could be learning another language. It could be music. It really, the list of different hobbies and activities and extracurriculars goes on and on and on. And I think the most important thing here is going to be their level of commitment and maybe the depth rather than the breadth. PSAT here is also going to be really important in the fall. This is kind of last opportunity for any of those practice preliminary rounds before we start to really encourage the test prep and taking either the SAT or the ACT for the first time in the spring of junior year. So this is, again, something that we're going to dive deeper into in a future slide, but we do, for the time being, still encourage all students to go ahead and aim to take either the SAT and or the ACT at least once to give themselves the opportunity to get a good score and give themselves that little leg up, that boost in the application process that other students may not have. There's not necessarily too much harm in trying to take it at least once. But again, this is something that we'll dig into a little bit deeper in a future slide. You want to be cultivating really strong relationships with your teachers in junior year. 9th and 10th grade, definitely you're exploring, you're getting to know your different teachers and your peers and figuring out how high school works. And 11th grade is when we really want to kind of establish those relationships so that you can request your letters of recommendation no later than the spring. This is when you want to find those teachers that are going to be able to share stories about you, share about your progress and your growth over time. You want to be able to find teachers that, again, have the, first of all, time to fill out these letters of recommendation. So we want to ask them early before they fill up and before they get busy. But also you want to make sure these are teachers that you've already established a relationship with so that they feel comfortable writing this letter. In 11th grade, we will start building our preliminary college list. This is a great time to visit campuses if possible. Spring break is a huge opportunity to kind of go and explore. There's a lot of different, what we call college hubs in different states all across the country, where if you are going on a vacation or you happen to be visiting that state or that town, you might as well hit 2, 3, 4 different colleges all in that area. To kind of get a sense of the different campuses, your different options, but also the different neighborhoods, the weather, all of those kinds of different things that are going to go into your decision down the road. This is going to include college research on the websites. You're also going to want to look into the different colleges, their courses, their missions, their histories, all of those kinds of things, and kind of start considering which ones are top, which ones are interesting to you, and sort of building that college list. The summer activities, again, are going to be kind of your final opportunity to express any sort of interest in a professional field or an internship. If there's a certain job that you're looking to try to get now that you're older, this is a good time to show that you have work experience. There's a lot of different things you can kind of do with your summer, this last summer before senior year, to really show engagement. But in general, you're going to want to make sure that each summer is filled with some sort of enriching activity up until you're applying to college. And finally, as a senior, the summer before is when we want to really aim to get a majority of your application work done. We tend to have students put things off for a little bit. They think it's manageable. They're just going to be able to tackle it when the application's open, but they forget that they are going to be in school. They're going to be seniors. They're going to have homework. They're going to have senior things that they're going to have to worry about. And so filling out applications and writing essays on top of that can be very demanding, and it can be very stressful. So the majority of the work that we can get done over the summer, the more work we can get done, the better. It saves a lot of stress, saves a lot of time, and really helps students pace themselves so that they can enjoy their holidays when they're a senior, and sort of transition into making those decisions in the spring. So over the summer, we want to draft that activities list, all of those activities that your students spent participating in over the summer and over the school years. We're going to list them all out, and we're going to describe what they did in each of those activities. We're going to draft out all of our essays. There's going to be many, many different essays involved in the application process. Again, we have an entire slide on this coming up shortly, but there's numerous essays that are going to need to be planned out, and lots of effort is going to be put into these essays. So getting them planned out in the summer is going to be really helpful. Any final college visits, there's online virtual tours now, which can be really helpful. So making sure we're taking the time to get to know these different colleges that we're applying to, and not necessarily just sending applications out blind. We want to make sure these are thoughtful applications to schools that we are, really willing and excited to kind of attend in the future. So this is the last opportunity to sort of finalize that list by taking those tours. This is your last chance to retake the SAT or the ACT if you've taken it once in the spring and perhaps think that you can do it better the second time with a little bit more prep or a little bit more time. You can retake it. Perhaps if you've taken the SAT already and now you want to try the ACT and see if you can do better at the ACT, now would be the time to get that score in. Again, just so we can see if that's going to give you a boost and give you a leg up that maybe other students might not be submitting. Continue to work hard in your classes. Your senior grades do matter. As I mentioned, you will be submitting your senior grades and your senior courses eventually. So you definitely have to continue getting good grades in your senior year. And as I mentioned, we're going to be finalizing those college essays and those applications in the fall. We're going to be hopefully just filling them all out, getting them submitted, and then working on any last financial aid information that pops up along the way. We're going to be helping your student sort of collect and organize all of those different decisions that come in along the way in the spring of senior year. And then the goal for all seniors is to have their final decision and their deposit submitted by May 1st of their senior year. So this brings us to the kind of first question that we get from a lot of parents, and generally something that we jump into with our juniors right away, which is, how can we help determine what is the best fit for your student and which college they're going to be the happiest at? Finding the right fit for your student involves a lot of different information, and it's important to be able to consider all of your options and sort of all of the different opportunities that are presented to them with the different data and criteria that they've selected. So it's about who your student is. It's about where they're going to fit in, where they're going to thrive, where they're going to be successful. But it's also going to be about a school that really matches their goals, their preferences, their personality, and, overall environment that they're going to do well in. So there's a number of different things that we consider when we do help a student assess which college or which colleges will be a good fit. These include things like the size of a school. Smaller schools are going to be much more intimate, maybe have a lot less options as far as classes and sports and extracurriculars, but they're going to have very small class ratios. Where on the flip side, you have large schools with, tons of sports and different classes that you can choose from. But the class sizes as well are going to be large, and the students are going to be a little bit more independent on their own. Geographic location is going to be really important. How far from home is the student? Do they like the weather? Can they handle the weather? Is transportation to and from this school going to be an issue? Of course, we want to consider the academic environment. Does this school offer the programs or the courses of study that your student is looking for? Is there a pathway into a graduate school that they're excited about? Is there a pre-professional course that they're looking for? Does the school culture or social life match your student? Are the different sororities and fraternities exciting to your student? Or are they looking for maybe a smaller, again, more quaint campus where they can kind of have more peace and quiet? Are the extracurriculars and sports going to be really important to your student? Do we need, those Division I kind of athletes, or are we looking maybe more for opportunities on campus as far as clubs go? Cost, financial aid, of course, is huge, a big factor. We can definitely, make sure that your student is considering how much they're going to be receiving from various avenues and how much overall they can kind of expect to pay in the end. And then there's so many other things that go into it when we sit down and, work with your student. There's different criteria that are going to pop up and be important to them that, again, aren't going to be important to others. So it's important to really get to know the student and what they want from this experience. So we take all of this into consideration and we help build the college list. Building a college list is going to be a matter of figuring out which schools are going to be, a good fit for your student academically and are going to give you good chances of admission, as well as which schools are going to challenge your student and kind of push them a little bit, and which ones are going to give them the safety of knowing that maybe they're going to have better chances of admission. So we really want a balanced list. The goal is kind of the quality, not quantity in this situation. We recently got some information or some data from Rutgers that they received 60% more applications this year than last year, than just the previous year. And that's just one school. So you can imagine that with COVID and with kind of this recent anxiety about sort of where we're headed and what colleges are using for this application process, these colleges are getting inundated and flooded with many, 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 many applications, many more than they were having before. And the campuses are not growing. The schools are not getting any bigger, right? So unfortunately, they're not able to accept all of those students that are applying, and the competitiveness is getting higher and higher, and it's getting harder and harder for more students to get accepted. So the key here is not necessarily going to be to apply to as many schools as possible, but rather making sure that your list, again, is really balanced and includes colleges from each category, a likely category, a target category, a reach or lottery category, that you have multiple options being considered. You're not necessarily too fixated on just one or two schools. And that, again, these are schools that really meet your criteria and are going to be a good fit for you. These aren't just shots in the dark. These are highly curated lists. We want to prioritize what's important to your student and make sure that, again, all of these things are going to be a good fit, the academic quality, as well as the size, as well as the social fit. All of these things together can make it a good candidate for your college list.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was great. That was super thorough. One thing that I should have mentioned to you all before we got started was, in addition to sending out this recording, we're also going to email out the slide deck. So hopefully no one is worrying about furiously taking notes here. We will get that out to you so you can go ahead and look back at what we're discussing here as well. So, what we want to do now is, like Peggy said, we were going to narrow our focus a little bit on a few things that she was discussing earlier. And, one topic that we really wanted to cover, which was something that honestly, it probably came up in 30 to 40% of the questions that people submitted ahead of time, is what to do about extracurricular activities. And I think these questions, came out a lot of different ways, like what activities a college is looking for, what is the value of this specific activity, how much time should I be devoting to this, how many activities are required. Those are all great questions. I think the challenge of some of these questions is sometimes the answer is very unique to your student. So that's something that if we're working with you, we are happy to address that in the context of your student. But I think even given that, there are still some basic principles that are really helpful to keep in mind here as you're considering what path for your student makes sense. So first of all, I think one of the biggest questions we get about extracurriculars is, do they want a lot or do they want a few? Is it the quality or is it the quantity thing? I say if you have to choose, I think quality is going to be more important here. And you can see the first point on the slide. Colleges want to build a well-rounded class, not a class made up of entirely well-rounded students. So what they're not necessarily looking for is a student who is in, the academic decathlon and also plays soccer and plays the trombone and has 5 different other activities. But, they're going to have a class where across that entire class of students, they have that trombone player and they have that soccer player and they have all these different things. For each individual student, what you're looking for, as we say in the second point there, is that ability to communicate some kind of sustained commitment, some kind of sustained interest that you're showing in your activities throughout your high school career. Often it's great if a couple of those activities do match up or match the narrative of the rest of your application. So for example, if you are a student who is considering med school eventually, maybe you have pursued volunteering at a hospital or, a pediatric rehab facility or something like that, and you have taken electives in anatomy and physiology, and you have pursued other extracurriculars related to that. That's great, if you have a couple things that help reinforce that narrative. But it doesn't mean that every extracurricular you do has to be related to applying to med school or getting to med school eventually. What it does mean is if you have a couple of those, great. And then hopefully you have a couple other extracurriculars you have participated in throughout high school where you started early, you've been able to deepen your involvement in that over time. Ideally, like Peggy said, progressing into some kind of leadership role, as you move through high school. I do think sometimes students have kind of a narrow conception of what a leadership role entails in an extracurricular. And I've had kids tell me, oh, I don't really like public speaking, or I don't like being the boss who's in charge of everyone. I don't see how I could have a leadership role. It doesn't just mean that you have to be the president of the club or something like that. It could be as simple as, maybe you initiated a special project within the club. Maybe you've mentored younger students. You can take a broader vision of what leadership actually means, and you can communicate that in your application. So I think that's one thing to think about with extracurriculars. One caution here that I sometimes see with students, sometimes kids will, try a whole variety of activities, which is great. They should do that in ninth grade. But then they don't really narrow it down, or, maybe they quit a couple of those and then they join a couple other things, but they never really make a deeper commitment to that activity. So they kind of just show up to club meetings every week, but, it's kind of on the phone it in level. It's pretty casual. Really, when students are applying to more competitive colleges are looking to see that this is something students are invested in. They've made an impact that is a little bit broader on their community, on their school, something like that. So that's kind of the general thinking around extracurriculars. Summer specifically, we get a lot of questions about as well. I think for summer, there's a variety of things that can work here. Sometimes families will get a little bit fixated on things like pre-college programs or internships, or like it needs to be this one specific thing. And, I've heard repeatedly from admissions offices that that's really not the case. They're open to seeing a lot of different things from students. I think the key here is, do something. First of all, don't just spend the whole summer on your phone or playing video games or something like that. There should be some sort of constructive activity, whether that is community service, whether you have a hobby you pursue at a really deep level and you're doing that over the summer. Maybe you have a paid job at Starbucks or Taco Bell. Great. There's a lot you can learn from that. Admissions offices really do value that. Pre-college programs, we'll probably talk about those a little bit later tonight, but those can be valuable as well for what they are. So lots of different options for the summer. I think as long as it is something that you care about as the student, it fits with the rest of your application, it's a productive use of your time, then great. There are a lot of different options that could make sense out there. The final thing I would say about this is what we have in bold on the bottom. You should be able to explain why you participate in your activities. This is a helpful reminder as you're thinking about the narrative of your application or the picture that it presents of you to the college. Sometimes, kids will do something on their application because it feels like everyone else is doing it, like starting a nonprofit or doing a passion project or doing a pre-college program or research or something like that. But if the admissions officers read this, they see that in your application, but they don't get a sense of this is why the student did it. Like they really had an interest in this specific topic or this thing, like it really makes sense that they did this. The admissions office can walk away from that feeling like they just did this for the application, or it was something that their parents suggested that they do. So I think really what you're looking for, and it's kind of a hard thing to say, like, you should do this, you should be authentic. But really what they're looking for is that authenticity. It is that genuine passion from the student that really is going to come through in their activities they've chosen to do, in how they've spent their summer. I've often posed the question to some of my students, like, if you literally couldn't put this on your college application, if you couldn't list it as an activity, would you still choose to do it? Is this still how you would spend your time? And if they tell me, yes, like I would have done this anyways, I love it, fabulous. That's going to be a great thing to list on their activities. So that's a little bit about extracurriculars. Next thing we're going to chat about a bit here is standardized testing. So I think if extracurriculars were 30% of the questions I got, standardized testing might have been 40%, maybe more. And I think for good reason. Standardized testing, unfortunately, is one of the things in the college admissions world right now that is just incredibly confusing. And I'll say that this goes for college counselors as well. I've heard from many other counselors who, also feel like this is it's a tough topic. It's a tough decision. I think most of you are probably familiar with, the landscape of testing right now, how this looks at different schools. But just to go over some of the terminology you'll encounter here, obviously, starting with COVID, a lot of schools got rid of that longstanding requirement to submit the SAT or the ACT score. A few schools have gone and reinstated their requirement. So those are on the very first line that you see on the slide there, the set of test required schools. So notably, Purdue, MIT, Georgetown, all of those you do need to submit SAT or ACT scores. There are a set of major public universities in Tennessee, Florida, and Georgia. And this includes big schools like Georgia Tech or University of Florida, Florida State, University of Tennessee. Also, all the big military academies like West Point and the Air Force Academy. So all of those schools just straight up require the test. So if you think you're applying there, if you have an idea that eventually you might want to apply there, you're going to want to take the test, prepare for it, and make sure you're squared away. Now, this is where it starts getting a little bit more confusing, is when we get into the middle category here. As you can see, I mentioned a category called test preferred. And sometimes colleges make it clear that they fall in this category. Auburn is one of them, where they actually do say on their website that they prefer, if possible, that you submit test scores, but they don't absolutely require it. There are other schools out there where it's honestly more rumor-based and what people have heard from admissions officers on podcasts or in other conversations. Boston College is one of the schools where people think, yes, they like to have scores. I think Tulane is another one. There are several others out there. The Ivies in general, people tend to think that they prefer to have test scores. So test preferred is a thing. Test optional is the biggest official category that you're going to hear out there. I think most colleges are going to fall into this bucket where they say, we don't need the test score. We will consider your application without it. But if you do submit it, then we will look at that with the rest of your application. We'll use that in our admissions decision. So that's test optional. And then finally, there's a fourth category, which is test blind, which I think a lot of us in California are familiar with, because obviously the UCs, so the whole University of California system, as well as the CSUs, are going to fall into this bucket. And what test blind means is literally they do not want to see your test scores. They're not asking for it. If you send it in, they're not going to look at it. They are totally test blind. So they're basing their decision on all the rest of your application. SAT and ACT scores do not play a role there at all. So that is the general terminology. Those are the categories involved in standardized testing here. Probably the single biggest question we get from parents about this is, does it make sense for my student to pursue SAT or ACT testing? And if they do, okay, we got this score, should we be submitting this to this school or that school? It's difficult. It's a difficult decision. It's a very opaque process, and it has shifted over time quite a bit. One thing that I'll mention, some of you might have seen this article, it just came out like a week or two ago in the New York Times. And it was one of the first major articles in a while that mentioned, some resurgence of interest on the part of colleges in moving back to requiring potentially some testing, or at least seeing the value in standardized testing. Notably, I mean, Brown is not a school that currently requires it. They're test optional. But the president of Brown did specifically say that, they do potentially see a role for testing. The SAT and ACT scores are a helpful data point for them in addition to the rest of the student's application. The article also goes through a whole body of research about the value of the test scores, not on their own, but again, alongside other things like GPA, the other parts of the application. So, there really, to be honest, there hasn't been much major movement yet, apart from what you see on this slide here. But I think for those of you who are parents of 9th graders and 10th graders, I think it's worth keeping an eye on this landscape and considering like this may be a part of what your student is going to want to do going forward. So, to get to answer those specific questions down there. So should your student in particular take the SAT or the ACT? This is a question, it is individual, and it's something we're happy to talk through with your family. But if pressed to answer this for an entire group, what I would say is yes, I think most students should try one of the tests at least once. You just want to see how it goes. Sometimes you don't know until you try. And I think, like Peggy said earlier, if you're able to take a test and get a high score relative to other students, relative to the average score at the school, great. It is a benefit to your application, apart from schools that are test blind. It will help you. So I think if your student has the ability to do that, it's a net plus, something they should pursue. Should you submit scores? This is the hard part here. So sometimes we'll have a student who has, a 1350 or 1400, very, very respectable score. And they're trying to figure out, should I submit this to any schools? What about this school? What about that one? Up until recently, the advice has been, coming from colleges, the advice has been take a look at the median score for admitted students for the school. And if your score is above the median, then you should submit it. The problem with that, for any of you with a statistics background, you can imagine what's happened here. As you get a smaller and smaller group of students who are submitting those scores, that median has crept higher and higher over the last couple of years. So we have a number of schools out there where maybe only 40% of students submitted scores, and now the median is 1550 or something like that. So at this point, the data is not as helpful as it was. So I think the decision has become a little bit more complicated. What I would say is now you might want to take a look at the 25th percentile and see where your student score lands relative to that. This is also a little bit complicated, but you might want to think about the rest of your student's application, their GPA, their course rigor, and think about how their SAT score, really matches up with those things. And if their SAT score seems like it's kind of punching above its weight, so to speak, if they're testing well, even if the score is below the median, it may still make sense to submit the score to bolster the rest of their application and to show that the student is able to do that higher level academic work. So again, tough decision. I have all the sympathy in the world for families going through this because colleges have made this difficult. It's opaque. But again, this is something that we're very happy to help students with. We're happy to help answer questions parents have about this. Okay, and with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Matt, who's going to talk to us a little bit about college essays.
All right, good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be with you. Okay, so my goal here was to try to demystify the essay writing process and maybe take away some of the part of it that can be overly daunting or concerning for students. When I onboard a new student, one of the major questions I ask them is what concerns they have in this college application process. And greater than 70% of the time, students will mention the essays as something they are concerned about or something that unnerves them in some way. How do I access this, very challenging dimension of it? And I heard that other students are doing it in this way, or you always should say this or never say this. So there's a lot of ideas out there that students have going in this, and they can be relatively intense. It takes a specific kind of student to genuinely enjoy writing. And even though it is easier than most things to talk about oneself, it is quite a challenge to dig into the entire array of experiences that a student might have had over the last 4 years that might be relevant to their academic and career future. So there's quite a bit in there that is getting over the personal and emotional hurdle of beginning the process of writing the essays. Now, some of the things that are true about it is, yes, it is true that for the average student, essays will be one of the most time-intensive and labor-intensive parts of the college application process as a whole. And the truth is, every student is going to walk a unique path through this. You know, no two essays are going to be alike in this, but there are some major trends that we see, you know, both for California students and in this sort of post-COVID era of applications, and what has been happening in various admission offices across the country in response to that. So I wanted to give some insight into how that process will unfold. The average student, the average California student, will begin with the Common App essay. And that Common App is the prompts for that. They're offered 7 choices. And those choices tend to be relatively the same each year. They maintain consistency. So from year to year, we expect them to be the same with some minor tweaks occasionally, but they're generally the same questions. So there's something concrete there, and it means that we can start on the Common App a lot earlier for most students, or get a strong sense of what a student is going to say, right? Once that large personal narrative, that 650-word chunk, has been written, most students here in California will apply to at least one of the UCs, if not many of them. And that brings the personal insight questions. The UCs offer 8 prompts for that, and the student needs to choose 4 and knock out 350 words apiece. Now, this first task for Common App and the UCs, this is, you know, almost 2,000 words that a student has written already, and it's quite an undertaking. This is often, you know, the biggest part of the first couple months of summer for most juniors who are transitioning to senior year. So they'll put quite a bit of time into this. And at the beginning, when the process is fresh, this is quite an investment. There'll be a lot of refining and editing and drafting and revising that happens in this. After that body of work is done, those first 5 essays, the students will transition on to supplementals. And the breadth of this portion of the application is really dependent on the individual student and where he or she is applying. So supplementals can fluctuate all over the place, both in terms of the level of challenge or difficulty or complexity of a question and the length that is asked for in it. The shortest ones can sometimes be a vexingly short 100 words. So to take a lofty concept or an important set of details and refine them down to 100 words is a task far more difficult, in my opinion, than writing a long narrative in 650, because with that much space, there's breathing room. So there is quite a technique to being extremely concise as well. And then there are a few quirky universities out there like UChicago that assign 1 to 2 page narratives with no upper limit. And so there can be quite a bit of material that a student needs to develop in order to meet that condition. All right, so because the new supplementals that are released by universities do shift every year, and they are posted in early August, there's quite a bit of a transition that happens as that changeover occurs. And our goal is to have a student have finished at least their best drafts of the Common App and PIQs by that summer date. Now, when all is all told, all is said and done, students will, if they're applying to roughly 12 to 15 schools or so, they may take on 10 to 20 total essays. And that could be upwards of 5,000 words that they've written by the end of the process. So it's quite significant what's happening there. And that's why it's so time intensive. The thing is, though, for institutions that are receiving tens of thousands of applications from students all across the country and even internationally, a lot of these students tend to be highly qualified. And what the essays do is they provide a critical point of differentiation between students who may have very comparable academics or other types of achievements from each other. So a lot of the supplemental prompts from the more selective universities are really designed to elicit insights on character depth or emotional maturity or the application of life experiences to earned skills and how that will translate to, utilizing them effectively in college, or, what is the arc of improvement that a student has seen, over the course of dedicating time to various activities. And so oftentimes they really want to dig out something fundamental from the platform of, who a student really is. As a final point on this slide, the one thing I really wanted to acknowledge here is that there is a direct relationship between the selectivity of a specific institution and the challenge level and the number of essays assigned. And so you will absolutely see schools like, CSU Bakersfield assigning 0 supplemental essays, whereas a school as selective as Stanford has 8 separate individual ones and is quite an undertaking just for that single application to take that on. So in seeing that, there is definitely a big picture time budgeting puzzle to solve for every student in deciding whether to take on new universities, what the scope of a full list will be, and what that indicates about the amount of time that needs to be invested in order to meet those guidelines. Okay, so here are a few pro tips from this, and a lot of these are going to mimic what you will see in an academic English class around really good best practices and effective techniques for just writing well. Again, I can't stress enough that theoretically it's easiest to talk about oneself, but that doesn't mean that every person is going to engage with it the same way. We see landslides of different questions every year, from the vast array of different schools that are releasing new supplementals. And while they will vary greatly in terms of what they're focusing on, when we analyze them down to their core, what we're seeing is some pretty common categories that stretch across the scope for that. And so we've outlined a series of different boxes that the vast majority of supplemental essays fit into. And there are absolutely best practices and optimal approach angles for essays that tend to be successful or more successful than others. And so we're always encouraging students to focus on the manner and setup and structure that we know tends to work best when addressing a specific setup within the limits of a word count that is presented. And funny enough, oftentimes, even for students who struggle to even get that first word on the page, once they get the ball rolling with this, the interesting part of it is almost universally what we're doing with students at the end is trying to refine down what they have written too much of, right? It's rare that I have a student who in the end can't figure out how to say enough or even meet that word count. They're often trying to just fit everything they need to and want to say into the limiting word count presented to them. So that said, with every essay, there's definitely a unique response from any given student that is specific to that student at a moment in time for him or her, and is related to a specific question. So there are definitely best practices. There are stronger and weaker setups. There are stronger and weaker alignments and points of emphasis and so on. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is bring out a lot of the things that both Karen and Peggy mentioned about what fundamentally drives passion within this student and how we can recognize that and bring attention to it so that a discerning admissions officer who is reading applications at a mile a minute will notice it and latch onto it as a way to understand the student. The goal of all of this in the end is really to maintain internal consistency within an application. So this is a great construct here, but the full set of essays that a student writes to a specific university, really it should read like chapters from a book about that student's life. It should work to reveal a set of values, a set of skills, a set of aspirations, and applied experiences that represent the best that student has done over the course of high school, and that will be most relevant to what's ahead, right? And depending on where they're applying and to what program they are applying, the arrangement of those different constructs is going to be specifically focused towards that. Right. Karen, you want to move it ahead? Wonderful. Okay, here I wanted to provide some example prompts, just a few of them from each of the set, to give a clear picture as to what exactly schools tend to be asking. For the first two, the Common App and the PIQs, like I said, these are relatively static. So a lot of these are searchable easily on the internet, but this is a short snippet into the kinds of questions that are asked. With the supplementals, again, since those are changing constantly, this is a snapshot of a few of them from just this year, right? I have some good news should any of these questions seem like they are daunting, as many students feel, which is the biggest takeaway here is that this process gets easier as a student progresses through it. So if you read over a lot of these prompts, it's clear that while you're seeing variation in the exact topic that a question might be asking about, there is some very broad conceptual overlap between the questions. And so the best anecdotes, the best reflections, once all those great things are finalized and a student has the body of text that he or she likes, that information, that narrative, that particular set of text can be reused on essays that are not shared with another university. So for example, the UCs, they don't see what's written on the Common App essay because they have their own essays. So if a student answers the Common App or the UCs in one way, or tells one great story from an experience, that experience can then be retold and refitted for a different essay. Likewise, any school that receives a supplemental essay, they're not going to see what a student submits to any other. And so when we see questions that come up over and over that are similar to others, those can also be reused. They just have to be fitted and tailored directly to that question and with that university in mind. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to address here is the question I get the absolute most often in this, which from students and parents alike is, like test scores, what is it that constitutes a good answer to a question? And the thing I want to give you for this is that you really want to approach the answering a question on two levels, right? And the first is the literal. So if you look through the prompts here, you will see literal requests for information about a student's beliefs or ideas, right? About accomplishments that led to personal growth, about leadership experience, creativity, right? Character building, extracurricular activities, etc. So through the lens of that specific insight, or that specific activity or whatever it is, they're looking for a stream of insight that will allow them to see more about what's going on for a student. So it's got to be told through that literal lens. Yes, through an extracurricular, I discovered this. But then there's also level two, which is the subtext beneath the question. And the way I put this to students is, ask yourself what you think the question's really asking. And this is the harder part, but there is also a lot to unpack in this that's extraordinarily useful and extraordinarily helpful to the student in constructing good answers. So one needs to take into account the audience. Who are you speaking to and what drives this community, right? The specific community culture, the value system, the social zeitgeist that might be relevant on campus this year based on the national headlines that are relevant to that university, right? Do they have a faith-based background? Are they oriented in a certain way? Do they occupy a certain region of the US where different cultural ideas and values are more relevant, etc.? A student really needs to know their audience and then understand that when a question on the surface is asking for a change in a belief or idea, what they're really driving at underneath is, show us how well you reflect on past versions of yourself. And now with that, graduated maturity, right, are you going to take those same lessons and bring them to our campus and then contribute in a meaningful way to our culture and our community, right? So for example, almost every year I have a multitude of students who apply to schools like Loyola Marymount and Santa Clara. As many of you may know this, but both of those schools are Jesuit schools, right? They adhere to the Jesuit tradition. The philosophy of it is all over their website. One of the core values of the Jesuit faith is being a person for others. That is, the Jesuit tradition believes very strongly in altruism, in community service. And so successful essays that are crafted for universities like those really need to speak to a student's sense of community ethic, community service, volunteerism, altruism, philanthropy, etc. And if those essays are going to be successful, they're going to demonstrate that they clearly know I'm applying to a university that believes in these things. And the reason I'm applying is because I personally am aligned with them, and here's how. And so, all told, the best thing that we can do for any student is reframe this part of the essay writing process that is so daunting. And we restructure it into an opportunity, which is when you are in an ocean of a million other students who have similarities to you, here is your chance to shine, is to explain yourself and relate the experiences that you've had in a very meaningful way to demonstrate what a cool individual person you are and how well you know what is coming up next for you. And if you don't, how peacefully honest you are, and you can reflect on the process by which college will help you figure out how to sharpen and refine the things that you are looking for. Okay, that's what I have for you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate that. That was fantastic. So a couple other things that we are going to talk through here. Let's see. Okay, so wanted to back up a little bit. So we've talked a lot about specifics of extracurriculars. We've talked through a timeline. We've talked through college essays and standardized testing. Now, a lot of people are interested to know, what happens on the other end of this? So you get the application completed, you send it off to a college. What are they doing with this? What do they really value? How are they evaluating it? There's a couple ways that colleges look at applications on their end. And I think for a lot of the schools that students, in our group are applying to, they practice what's called holistic admissions. It's a word you're going to hear a lot in this process. A little bit of a facetious comment in the first bullet point here, but there's definitely some truth to it. One of the guys at Florida State said holistic admissions means that colleges, quote unquote, can do whatever they want and not have to tell you why they're doing that. There's a little bit more clarity to be found than that, but in reality, what holistic admissions means is there are a whole bunch of factors that the colleges are looking at in the students' application materials, but there isn't a formula. They're not saying, okay, you have to have, this minimum GPA, 30% of our decision is based on this thing. They're looking at the whole package that you're presenting, including a lot of the things that I mentioned there in those bullet points, like your GPA, the rigor of the courses that you took in high school, your extracurricular activities, your letters of recommendation, if they want those, your standardized test scores. They're taking all of these different pieces and more, and they're putting this together, and they're thinking about what they want for their particular class at this particular college. And is this student what we're looking for to fill out that class? So part of what I'm alluding to there is a tricky part of the admissions process, which is what is often referred to as like institutional priorities or the values that a college has. And this is kind of the black box part of college admissions, where maybe in a particular admissions cycle at a particular school, there's something that they are trying to shape in this class that they're admitting. Maybe they feel like they get too many students from their specific geographic area. So now they want to branch out and get more students from the Midwest or more students from Alaska or something like that. They can have that priority, and it's not something that the college is going to communicate to the world at large. So part of the reason I think that that's important for parents to understand, it's important for students to understand, is that sometimes families take the college admissions process very personally. And I can understand why. I mean, you're sending out all this information about yourself. If a college says no to you, or if they say yes to you, it all feels very personal. Like, I earned this, or they rejected me, they didn't like me. It's crushing, both for the student and often for the parents who are very invested in that process as well. But I do think it's important for everyone to remember that colleges, they really have their own thing going on. Yes, of course, they're looking at the quality of the applications before them, they're comparing students, but they also have their own institutional priorities. To be blunt, they have to make a class of students that can pay tuition and keep the school afloat. There's all sorts of things that are going on behind the scenes there. And also, to circle back to something that Peggy mentioned earlier, as we were talking about a balanced college list, the different types of schools that are out there, she used the term lottery schools, as we're talking about likely schools, target, reach, and then lottery. That's kind of the word that we use as we're talking about schools like the Ivy League, schools like Stanford, where you might have a 3% acceptance rate or a 5% acceptance rate, something like that. For schools like that, beyond the institutional priorities, they just get so many applications from students that, just on the face of them are perfect. They've got really high GPAs and they've got really, really high standardized test scores, and they've cured cancer, and they've done all of these different things. And it's really, really hard for those admissions offices to decide among all of those students. So, as part of the holistic admissions, sometimes it's going to feel like buying a lottery ticket, or it's going to feel like a roll of the dice. And I think truly that is how students should approach admissions to those kinds of schools. You want to put your best foot forward. You want to do your best work in high school. You want to give them the best application you can. But at that point, once you send it off to Harvard or Stanford, if you're aiming for a school like this, to MIT, you need to recognize that, it's a lottery ticket. It is kind of out of your hands at that point. And there's a lot that the schools are considering that's out of your hands. There's a lot of competition that you're up against. So part of the reason, that we mention all of this is just to give some guidance, I think, to parents and to students for how to talk about this internally as a family. It's, as I mentioned before, like this is an emotional process, so people have a lot invested in it. And I think it's just important for everyone to take a step back and remember, this decision, wherever you end up getting into school, it doesn't reflect your character necessarily. It doesn't reflect who you are as a person, whether that's the student or the parent. Often there are a lot of parts of this process that are out of your control. And ultimately, there are great fit schools for every student out there. There are many, many, many colleges and universities in this country. And really a lot of student success is just taking advantage of that opportunity wherever they end up. So if they end up at a big state school, if they end up at a small liberal arts college, take advantage of that. Go to your career center, make connections with professors. There's a lot that you can gain from every school students get admitted to out there. So that's a little bit about holistic admissions, what that looks like. For other schools, it actually is more straightforward. So as we mentioned at the bottom of the slide here, there are schools that practice more formulaic admissions, where, as you could imagine, they literally do have a formula. So the CSUs are like this. They have a mathematical formula where they weight your GPA. They, not for the CSUs, no standardized test scores, but there are going to be other things that they give a point value to, like extracurricular activities or your geographic location. That all goes into a formula, and then there's just going to be a mathematical cutoff to determine whether or not the student is admitted. So in a way, those are easier to wrap your mind around. But again, many schools that students are applying to do the holistic admissions that we talked about first. Okay, and then finally, we are coming to the end of our presentation here. I wanted to specifically address a couple more questions that parents had submitted in these forms. And again, acknowledge there were so many wonderful questions. We are going to do our best to reach out to all of you individually so we can try to answer those questions for you, probably next week. But for now, here are a couple that came up in different forms from many parents. One of the first questions here, pre-college summer programs is something we get questions about all the time. Many parents asked about this. If you're not sure about what pre-college programs are, generally these are summer programs that are hosted on college campuses. They might last a week or a month or somewhere in between that. Often they're focused on a specific academic field like architecture or engineering, computer science, something like that, public speaking. A lot of college campuses have these. Sometimes they're taught by professors, sometimes students, sometimes they bring in people from outside the college to teach it. They can look very different from program to program. They are typically paid, so they are typically an activity that the family has to pay for. Some of them can be quite pricey. There are activities that, or pre-college programs rather, where maybe they're less expensive, maybe they're application-based, they're more competitive to get into. So just so you know, there is a wide spectrum of what these programs actually look like. The question we get from parents, though, is like, are these helpful? which is a great question. And to that, I usually respond with another question, which is helpful in what sense? So normally when parents are asking that, they're asking, is it helpful for college admissions to do a pre-college program like that? And the answer to this from most people in the admissions world that I've talked to is, unfortunately, that these pre-college programs aren't the most helpful thing for college admissions. They're not negative, they're not going to take away from your application, but I think a lot of admissions offices know what these are, and they recognize that these are programs, that you pay to access, and they're pretty short term, so it's not going to be like a big special undertaking on your part. Now, with that being said, there is a lot that students can gain from those pre-college programs. I had a student last year who, I think actually 2 years ago, he went through a pre-college engineering program down in San Diego. And it helped him get exposure to the different kind of subfields within engineering, like civil, mechanical, electrical, all of that. And it did give him a lot of insight into what he was potentially interested in pursuing within engineering. He had a cool project he worked on that really got him fired up. He was able to think more about that. He expanded that into a project during the school year. So I think if you're doing a pre-college program that relates to your students' interests, maybe a professional path for them in the future, and again, you're happy if they do it and they get something from it, regardless of the impact on admissions, then great. It can be a really, really productive way to use your summer. But as for whether it's helpful just for an admissions boost, for that, the answer is usually no. The answer changes a little bit if it's one of the more competitive programs you have to apply to get into. But for your average program, your value you're getting out of it is really that educational experience as you're in the program. The side topic there, what about internships, jobs, other opportunities? I won't spend too long on this. I kind of got to this earlier when we were talking about extracurricular activities. But in general, again, any activity that is productive, that the student is authentically interested in, they can answer why they're doing this. They're making an impact. They're not just showing up and phoning it in. They're getting something out of it. Great. Paid jobs are probably underrated. I think a lot of parents focus on internships because they sound better. But I have heard someone in the Yale admissions office say, I wish more students would have paid jobs, because there's a lot that they can learn just from that experience of regularly showing up to work, interacting with the public, taking on responsibility. It's something that's become harder for students to do, and it's something that's valuable. So a couple things to consider there. Question number 2, this is another question we frequently get in different forms. Do students need to take as many AP classes as possible, whatever that looks like at your school? Great question. The answer is no, you don't need to max out every single AP that your school offers. But what I really try to communicate to parents here is that there are a lot of trade-offs in the college application process and in college admissions. And I think this is one of the big ones. I wouldn't sugarcoat it. I will say that a lot of the students who get admitted to schools like Harvard and Stanford, those are the students who, without a lot of trouble, are pretty much maxing out the APs they can take. They're taking a lot of AP classes. They're doing well in them. They're still taking a lot of, doing a lot of other extracurricular activities as well and doing great work in those. So I don't want to sugarcoat that. Like, that is kind of what you're up against for those schools. Not to say there aren't kids who have gotten in without all of that, but that's kind of your average student applying to the Ivies. Again, with that being said, there are many, many, many wonderful colleges throughout this country. And I think it's a mistake for every student to try to, without really thinking about it, maximize the number of APs they're taking, try to take the highest rigor of every single course that's offered. In general, I think the best advice here is do try to be persistent with all of those core academic subjects all the way through high school. That is something the UCs look for. That's something a lot of colleges look for. So try to hang in there with math, science, history, English, foreign language as much as you can all 4 years. But if it's going to be detrimental to the students' mental health, if it's going to be detrimental to their ability to keep up their grades in all of their classes across the board, then no, they should not be taking APs in every subject. They should consider carefully where are the subjects where I'm really interested in this, where I'm going to be able to excel, where do I like the teacher, what is my counselor at school telling me? it can be kind of a bigger conversation, with the family, with the school, to figure out what's going to be the best course of action there. And again, if you're talking with us, as a counseling service, then we are very happy to make recommendations, talk with you, talk with your student, and advise on a good course of action as far as courses for next year. Okay, and that is a great segue to the final thing I was going to talk about tonight. Thank you all so much for hanging in there. The last thing I wanted to talk about is if you are interested in talking with us about college counseling and what that looks like with our team. This is just a very brief summary of how we tend to work with students. So just so you know, in 9th and 10th grade, for those of you who have younger students here, we do meet on a very flexible hourly basis. We typically recommend 3 or 4 meetings a year. We're checking in on the things I mentioned there. So course selection, extracurriculars, summer activities, making a plan for standardized testing, things like that. But it really doesn't need to be too intense at those ages. There's not a lot to do besides that. As we get into 11th and 12th grade, like Peggy mentioned earlier, now the rubber meets the road for the admissions process, and we're doing a lot more work. So we really have 2 ways we work with students in 11th and 12th grade. We do have a comprehensive counseling package where we can start with students January of their junior year, work with them pretty much all the way through until December, January of senior year. We take them through the whole process from building that college list all the way through getting applications completed and submitted, all the essay work in the middle of that. So we're going to do all of that within the package. If you are looking for something a little bit more flexible, or your student doesn't need quite as much assistance with it, then we also will be happy to do the hourly college counseling support in that process as well. I should also mention, if your student has the application process covered, or if you can support them with that at home, we do also offer college essay support just on its own with one of our college essay coaches, where we can help with all of what Matt was talking about, where it's brainstorming, we have drafting, prompt selection, editing, revising, cutting it down is always a big thing, like Matt said earlier. So we're happy to talk with you about any of that. We do have an email address here, collegecounseling@ajtutoring.com is probably the best way to get a hold of us. So feel free, you're welcome to reach out that way to get in touch. But like I said, we will try to reach out to everyone next week as well. So I think that is everything we have. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that slideshow so I can see everyone. Wow. Thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Like I said, we will send out the recording. We'll send out the slides. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. But otherwise, have a great evening. Thank you again for being here.